When he returned from the hospital, he wore a zipper of stitches down his chest, a loosely hanging shirt on his skeletal frame, and a raspy voice that sounded almost feminine. He spent those weeks of recuperation mostly in his green easy chair, pointed toward the living room television set, too afraid, it seemed to me, to get up and risk exertion, hyper-aware of his wobbly heart. One evening, while I was watching TV, my father sat in his chair working on his crossword puzzle. He tended to talk to himself. 6 letters, Hungarian River. While he worked his puzzle, which I found particularly comfortable that night, it told me he was still alive and I could concentrate on my show. At one point, he stopped murmuring. I looked over. My father was looking at me, or rather through me, to some point far in the far distance. He blinked. His reading glasses were perched above his forehead. "Everything okay, Dad?" I said. He closed his eyes and grimaced. "Dad?" My father opened his mouth and bellowed. I'd never heard such a sound, half bark, half wail. His eyes focused and met mine. "I can't do this anymore," he said between intakes of air, in a frightened boy sort of way. He lifted himself from his chair, threw his pen in the folded newspaper section at me, and went to bed. "You," he said to me as he reached his bedroom door a few feet away, "go to bed." Before I did, I looked at the crossword puzzle. In the hour we were together, he had filled in 2 words. My father's moaning cry that night still haunts me. It was as if someone had told Picasso he couldn't paint anymore. My father loved words. He relied upon his vocabulary to win over juries and judges. He disdained most adjectives and adverbs. He hunted for meaty nouns and verbs. Now words eluded him, it seemed, ran from him, refused to come when he snapped his fingers. Had he, in the mutiny of words, felt his life ebbing, retreating? First you forget a word, and then another, and another, until finally you forget every word. What happens when every word escapes? Had my father admitted to me that night that his life, the collage of words made into stories taped and glued together by memory, was unraveling? I remember now another evening 10 years before that haunting night when my father and I sat together at the kitchen table for 2 hours constructing coherent sentences with my week's list of 20 vocabulary words. In the end, we created one long, elegant sentence using all the disparate words, a feat that later impressed my teacher. At 50, he seemed to be dangling from the loop of the letter Y, found at the end of some word that was slowly fading. Without these collected fragments of moments, these pieces of days that we can retrieve and savor and even weep over, if we must, I fear we will no longer know who we are because we will not remember who we were. And if we don't know who we are, what's the point? Memories place us in the middle of a grand story on an impressive stage. My problem is I'm beginning to forget my lines. And that's no good. I can almost see the long hook inching its way toward me from stage left. So I go deep into memory, even live in memory for a while, because if I have sprung a leak, if my memories are dripping out of me, then I need to enjoy them while I have them. Sometimes I forget a person's name or a street name. That's expected, I suppose. But sometimes old acquaintances pass me on the street and I can't place them at all. In those lonely moments I recall those Tule Lake geese and envy them for their prodigious memory. They had burned into their tiny brains the map pointing out the most direct route from the Arctic Circle to Guadalajara, all the best watering holes along the way, and in the case of those who frequented it, the invisible border of the Tule Lake Reserve, so they could, with impunity, taunt hunters like my father, who often traveled with a loaded shotgun and a sense of fair play. And I think of every dog that knows where the bones are buried, and of antelope that remembers exactly the sound a lion makes when it's prowling in the tall Serengeti grass. I know I'm not like them. I want to remember what they cannot, what I'm grateful for, and what I regret. I know we are hanging on a very thin thread of now, aware that our brief lives are bookended by 2 silent, daunting eternities. I don't want that thread to snap prematurely, but before I have the chance to squeeze every last ounce of life out of every last memory. I don't want to forget anything. So, against the disconsolate drips of leaking memories, I remember the first day of my paper route, a Sunday before dawn with my father driving along my route at a steady 3 miles an hour, working his crossword puzzle while steering, keeping an eye on me as I run as fast as my 9-year-old legs will let me. Back and forth, station wagon to front porches, knowing that the sooner I get done, the sooner we get to Winchell's Donut House. I remember later that morning at dawn, while waiting in line to order our donuts, how my father struck up a conversation with a friend of his. I prayed with my eyes shut that he wouldn't call me Greg when he introduced me. He gripped my shoulder first, then patted me at my back as he said, "This is my son, Pat." I was so relieved that he remembered. As my short-term memory phrase these days, I'm hoping that somewhere deep in my brain, in a terrain one might call the soul, someone installed a memory chip that cannot be removed or erased, one that holds all the ancient stories, an embedded memory, if you like, linking me forever to every human being who's ever lived and who will ever live. But if that wish seems too grandiose, I'll settle for a chip that keeps tidy and easily accessible those memories I've come to cherish, especially those of my father, who looms large these days as I near the age of his death. I think there might be such a chip, what Australian Aborigines refer to as dream time, a primordial memory linking us all to the beginning of time itself. I say this because of another memory, for me, my most ancient. A few years ago, I was back in my old neighborhood. I parked the car next to my old house. It was autumn because the tree in my old front yard, a tree my father planted before I was even born, was a flourish of red and orange and yellow. The mellow maple leaves blanketing the front yard triggered a memory. I was maybe 4 years old. In my memory, it was a cool, brisk November day at twilight, sitting on the front porch steps playing with my slinky. I saw my father's car, a white GTO Pontiac convertible, making its way up the street. He pulled into the driveway, cut the ignition, looked over at me, and smiled. I jumped up from the step as he climbed out of the car. "Daddy," I said as I ran toward him. As he neared the red brick walkway, I leaped, and my father swallowed me in his arms. I hugged his neck and detected a residue of aftershave. He held me close as I peered over his shoulder onto a street of yellow-windowed houses. My father kissed me on the cheek, hoisted me onto his shoulders, and took me inside the house. It was the first time I remember my father kissing me. Thank you.